Okay, if everybody can take their seats, we're about ready to get started. Are people outside? Yeah. So for this evening's discussion panel, I wanted to introduce to you Dr. Andrew Davison. He's the Starbridge Lecturer in Theology and the Natural Sciences in the Divinity Faculty here at Cambridge, and he'll be moderating this discussion. I also wanted to note that he recently has a book called Participation in God that just came out with Cambridge University Press, the most complete treatment of the doctrine of participation that exists, so I encourage you all to take a look, and please welcome our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you, Austin. We're finding our way as to how to use these sessions at the end of the day, and my suggestion is that I will issue a few provocations for thought from this panel, drawing on my hearing of what's been said over the day. Then I'll let anyone up here who wants to raise a topic for us to think about together do that, and then we'll turn it over to you. And I'll try and make sure we finish in good time, because it has been a wonderful but long day for us. So first of all, a comment really that's based in science. I think I was coming here expecting that a Trinitarian ontology would be really above all things about the number 3. And it would be about finding threefoldness in our ontology. But I've also been struck by the way in which certain qualities or concepts have turned out to be important for a Trinitarian view of ontology. And I'm thinking particularly of Father Masborough's comment this morning about Christianity going beyond the metaphysics of the ancient world, that merely sought to gather and comment upon bodies and their motions, to take in categories like person and relation as absolutely central. And I'm sure there's a story to be told about Western metaphysics losing that insight. And the old view, perhaps maybe an especially spare account of the old view, seems to be much in show in the sciences. In fact, for many, it would seem that to have a scientific perspective is simply exactly to go right back and even further back to say there is only matter and its motions, and that any idea that relation or personhood might be real as matter and its motions is just ridiculous. They're not things, they're merely accidental. And yet, in some recent writing on science, we've seen such a resurgence of anti-reductionism and within science itself, and a new attention on the priority of wholes over parts, which I think puts relation back on the table as just absolutely integral to science. And from a few people, a new exploration of the irreducibility of the reality of personhood. So I think of Andrew Steen's fantastic recent book, Professor of Quantum Mechanics at Oxford, Science and Humanity, arguing for the irreducible reality of personhood and community, and other people, Andy Pross, the chemist, writing about life as just as a state of matter, just as we would say there was a reality to solidity, liquidity, vaporousness. Life, he thinks, has that level of reality. It's there for nature to discover and realize. So there's a comment from my scientific perspective. I'll get one scientific comment in, that it seems like so much of the most exciting discussions in science, the moment of philosophy of science, is precisely over whether we just become completely reductive and lose all the insights of what a Trinitarian ontology has added to the picture, compared to this maybe surprising and not always by any means theological reassertion that actually good science needs to take the priority of wholes over parts seriously, and therefore relation, and maybe even the idea that that personhood is an irreducible part of what's out there. So that's more a comment from me. I don't know whether any of my colleagues want to say anything about that. In which case, I want to say two things that will just be a bit provocative. And the first one is to try and help us to think a bit programmatically about what would it mean for an ontology to be Trinitarian. And I want to do that by posing what seems like a problem, a question about why the study of the ontology of creaturely being, at least, we might find it difficult to think of it as being Trinitarian from a theological perspective. And so I can get at this three ways. One would be the idea of the hiddenness of God. Another would be the idea that the Trinity is part of dogma that is only known by revelation. So you don't get to the Trinity by study of nature. And the third would be this maxim, which is sometimes attributed to Augustine, I'm not sure he ever actually says it, that the external acts of the Trinity are not divided with respect to the persons. So if we took something like those perspectives seriously, we might have some reason to think that at least created being wouldn't have straight away a Trinitarian character to it. Now, how might we deal with that, thinking about it? Well, one would be just to deny the premises, the maxim, for instance. One might be to say, well, okay, that applies only to ontology, the ontology of creaturely things, but immediately a threefold or Trinitarian character comes in when we start thinking about the origin of all of that in God. Or I wonder whether we might say something like it's there, hidden, latent, but always a matter of hindsight or thinking after. So I think of a wonderful passage by Balthasar on the cross in Mysterium Pascale, where he says, the world is inscribed with the character of a cross. It's just until the crucifixion, you don't see it, but then you look back. And so maybe that's a way in which we could talk about the character of being Trinitarian, even if we want to uphold some of those ideas of the Trinity being that which comes only by revelation, or the external acts of the Trinity being undivided as to person. So a provocation, maybe we should think that the Trinitarian character of ontology is actually a little bit more difficult or needs a little bit more arguing for because of some of those theological principles. Does anyone want to pick that up?
Yeah, so I mean, that's one reason why I stressed that I actually think that the united action of the Trinity ad extra is positively linked to a Trinitarian ontology, because the point would be then that you only apprehend the Trinity through the disclosure of the Trinity through the immanent structures of time. Therefore, in the very act of revelation itself, and I think this is really clear in De Trinitate, you've already embarked on a Trinitarian ontology. It's not something that comes at the end. And the implication of that is that things like revelation and grace are part of ontology. They're not sort of extrinsic, optional extras coming from a voluntarist God. On the contrary, we now see being in terms of revelation and grace. That in terms of the idea that we are, that creation through spiritual existence is destined to go beyond nature. So that it's an ontology that includes the supernatural. Otherwise, you're really not quite getting it. It would be my point of view, I think. And it means then that things like gift and revelation and then event become part of your ontology, if you like. And then, that it turns out that paradoxically, a temporal unfolding is a key to the eternal, for example. I mean, those would be my sort of initial responses to that kind of objection.
Thank you. Anyone else want to say?
Yes, you hear me? Yes. For me, it's not even an objection. I think it is the basis to remember that God remains hidden and that we only know him through revelation. It's very important to remind that all we have is given through a revelation in the scripture, and so we have to be faithful to what is given to us. We are receiving something and we are trying to interpret it. The danger is that we are always tempted to reconstruct the object in our image. And that's exactly the contrary we should do. We should always be faithful and receive and try to understand what we receive, of course, but not. We shouldn't be constructing the object for ourselves. And I think that's why what I've called theology of eminence reminds us. It's only a formal principle, but it reminds us any content you put in within Trinitarian theology. It reminds us that we must remain faithful. Well, I mean, when Augustine speaks of humility, we could, in a scientific way, call it be faithful to what you receive. Each science has to be faithful to its object.
Can I then sort of ask Olivier a question? Because it seems to me that when Augustine is thinking about revelation, he's not simply thinking of it as I mean, certainly something extraordinary is happening, but the very fact that it's happening through the incarnation means that historical processes, which in a certain sense are constructed, are being transformed, whether we're thinking about nature or about humanity. So that he insists that even when we're talking about revelation, we're only imaging God either as mind or as body, in a sort of oscillation between the two, and not just one, and not just the other, and not just neither. So that it's that sense of mediation that seems to me to be very strong, whereby you have to reassess the whole of nature and culture, and you know the words of the Bible are referring back to nature. They only include images of nature, and the two books have to be interpreted in terms of each other, and in a way, by pointing to structures of sort of recollection and appropriation and anticipation, it's how these are being transfigured in a fusion of the divine and the human life, so that you know that sense of sort of revelation simply is over against us. I'm not sure, for me, even in terms of the incarnation, quite whether that feels right, because of the fact of mediation. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyone want to say anything?
You can come. Yeah. Do you want to come back on that?
Very shortly, because I don't want to be the only one to speak. What you are saying reminds us that all this revelation is the revelation of the revelation itself is an event, but it's a revelation of the event of the incarnation.
Yes.
It is the only way we can discover Trinity.
Yeah.
There is only one situation where we discover the Trinity. It's in the baptism of Christ. The baptism of Christ is the only theophany where the Trinity is revealed to us.
Central.
And in the first time of Christianity, the only representation of the Trinity was the baptism of Christ. Mm-hmm. There was no other way to make an image of the Trinity. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to speak more.
Well, I have three brief thoughts that are somewhat convergent and perhaps slightly different with the previous two esteemed commentators. First, it's obvious that in some sense, if we were to receive friendship with God as a gift and know it's a gift given, then there has to be something, as Professor Boulnois was underscoring, deeply gratuitous about it. And the new light of Trinitarian knowledge can cast a light on everything that should enter into our reflections all the way down, but which also always retains a note of gratuity, so that we know that there's a privilege to the fact that we've been given knowledge of who God is in himself, albeit in the opaqueness and darkness of faith, but really as a gift of baptism and as a gift of grace. At the same time, I'd just say, this is part of the first point still, there's also the gift of a new darkness. The obscurity of the Trinity is not simply, as it were, an obscurity from apophatic theology of metaphysical kind or the opacity of our natural knowledge of the divine or the absolute. It's a new darkness that is a cloud of unknowing. It's also a school of intimacy. And when we receive new light of the Trinity, we also receive new conundrums, new problems. We're agitated by, but also spiritually invited into a new familiarity and a new hiddenness with God. The second thing and I think these are the mores of divine friendship. God illuminates us. He also, as it were, animates us to seek him under the new mores of divine darkness. Okay? The second thing I'd like to say is, Professor Milbank has written a lot about the problems of extrinsicism, and I share some of his concerns. I like the phrase gratuitous intrinsicism. I think when the Trinity is revealed to us, it speaks to our deepest desires for friendship with God, for knowledge of what's ultimate, for the teleological polarization of our life towards the absolute. But we also retain an awareness that in that intrinsic fulfillment that's being offered to us, something that anticipates the gift was already there, and something new has been given. So that's by way of a kind of a concordism. The third thing is, I do think, and here I guess I differ from Professor Boulnois, I do think we see in light of the revelation of the Trinity that there are anticipations in us of friendship with the Trinity that we didn't foresee in that respect, but that still remain irreducibly distinguishable. What I mean are things like the capacity to think about the transcendentals, which we didn't see prior to revelation as being oriented ultimately towards exercise, that knowledge exercise in friendship with God, which have a certain intelligible structure. And here you get into questions about how bad the fall is epistemologically on the human mind. I mean, does the fact that we've lost friendship with God in the darkness of nescience or ignorance also mean that we can't find anything out about the divine that anticipates an eventual fulfillment in Trinitarian knowledge? And I do think that we retain some kinds of good inclinations, although weakened. I'm using the language of the Council of Trent, obviously. We retain some good inclinations of the mind, weakened by sin, where we can still come to know something or think constructively in some way about God or the divine that are not eradicated, so that we need revelation for this friendship with God, but it speaks to an intrinsic orientation in us that it fulfills gratuitously.
As we talk about Trinity and Revelation and ontology, I'm reminded, of course, of that greatest of formulations of the Trinity in an epistemological mode, which is Barth's. If Barth had lived maybe 20 years later, he would have probably used the analogy of film, right? That God is both that which is revealed, revelation, that which is on the screen, so to say, and the medium through which that image is transmitted, the mediator, Christ, and that faculty within us which is capable of receiving the revelation. And of course, for Barth, that image of the Trinity is revelation, revealer, and revealedness, that which is revealed, that which reveals, and that which is capable of receiving the revelation, is important because he buys into Kant's understanding of our natural capacities. But I do wonder to what extent this Trinitarian conception, not of ontology as the subject of our thought, but of ontology as in its relation to a metaphysics of knowledge, I suppose, how that relates both to the subject here and to a view of the Trinity and Revelation that's not perhaps as willing to surrender to Kant. I don't know whether anybody has any thoughts on that.
Well, I might move us on to my third
Go ahead.
third provocation. But to say, when I was trying to navigate this in the participation book, how would the ontology be Trinitarian? I explore the idea of participation through Aristotle's four causes, and there are three of them that apply to God: efficient, formal, and final. And that although the external works of God are not divided as to persons, nonetheless there's a strong tradition, and you find it in Bonaventure and Aquinas, of appropriating things to persons, even if they're not divided. So in both of those authors and others, efficient causation is seen as having its wellspring in the Father, and formal causation in the Son, and final causation in the Spirit. And the language of appropriation allows us to find those associations without division. But it's perhaps the kind of thing you would only know where it came from once your eyes have been enlightened. So the third thing I wanted to say, which is really a provocation, try and play devil's advocate. I think I've spent most of my life trying to work on how important metaphysics is and how the practical consequences of it, and get it wrong, and all sorts of disastrous things happen. But how about if I turn that on its head and say, especially from the two esteemed colleagues on either side of me, we had quite a lot today on the dangers of metaphysics and the dangers and the necessity for care and precision, and I really appreciated that from both of you. But I was thinking about the very beginning of the Summa and the idea of what's theology for, and that Aquinas says there, principally it's to teach us about God, show us the love of God, and lead us to our homeland. And precision and writing careful books is definitely secondary. And I was thinking about the category in parenting theory of good enough parenting. You know, you don't have to be a perfect parent, but it's quite good to try and be a good enough parent. And maybe the real purpose of theological metaphysics is to be good enough metaphysics. You know, good enough to lead us to our heavenly home and communion with God. So, so that was, I suppose, especially a question to Professor Boulnois and Professor Wolfe about, yes, the necessity to be absolutely as precise as we can be, but what about the idea that actually we're most of the time going to get it somewhat wrong, and the real task for theology is a metaphysics that's good enough to get us home?
You remember that Freud says that all fathers are bad fathers. So I think that the question is not whether your metaphysics is good enough or bad or too bad, but I think the question is what is at stake when you introduce metaphysics within Trinitarian theology. And we cannot forget the history of this concept of a metaphysical Trinitarian thought. We cannot forget that, for example, Duns Scotus demonstrates the Trinity without one quotation of the Bible. He demonstrates it, and he says that the demonstration is even better than everything you find in the Metaphysics of Aristotle. So it's a sort of humble moment in his life. Yes. So you see, he does it very simply, because you take the intellect of the Aristotelian God, and he knows itself. So this knowledge is the Son, and you add to it that he loves himself as the Avicennian God. So you have the procession of the Spirit. So you have the intellect and the Spirit. You have the Son and the Holy Spirit. So clearly, this is a real danger, because if you do such quick metaphysics, the consequence is very clear. People will say, and that's precisely what Feuerbach says, you are projecting human psychological elements in the heavens. That's all.
But surely, your own work would tend to show that that's linked to the fact that Duns Scotus has forgotten the good metaphysics of the Trinity that is to do with substantive relation, where relation is naturally linked to event and revelation and so forth. And other things have gone wrong. He's forgotten about the simplicity of God. He's started to make the Trinity in some sense of secondary to the infinite essence and so on, so that it's not simply the dangers of a metaphysics, but forgetting a metaphysics that has already been transformed by divine revelation would be one way of putting it.
It's not only the case of, I chose because it's obvious, the case of Duns Scotus, but it's not only the case. I mean, the question of the appropriations, you already have the same problem, but it's not so clear. But I mean, the danger is there. So that's why I'm not giving a recipe. I'm only reminding the methodic warnings that were in the fathers, that were in the Greek fathers, that were uttered by Augustine. When you try to understand the Trinity, don't forget that any concept you are using should be overcome, should be negated, and that's only what I want to say. I am not giving a recipe for the good or bad interpretation of the Trinity. I'm not dealing with the content. I'm dealing with the principles.
Okay, I think that Aquinas, when he talks about that role of theology, talks not so much about metaphysics as about sacra doctrina, about theology as a lived thing, about going to church and so forth. I think we do metaphysics because we wake up and we can't be in church all day, every day, unless we're Dominicans. And we have and we have to have something else to occupy our minds for a few hours every day.
It's a very optimistic view of Dominicans.
Yeah.
But I don't think that metaphysics leads us home to God ever. I really do think that, to some extent, it's a therapeutic thing for our minds, which are just haunted by questions all the time. But I do think that all metaphysics are making pictures of the world, and there are no perfect pictures of the world. The pictures of the world that we make in metaphysics lead and guide our action and our thoughts, and to that extent, they're important. But we do always have to remember that they are just pictures that configure our place in the world slightly differently. I'm certainly with Austin Farrer on this. I think that's right.
The way I'm trying to look at it, though, is rather different from that, because I'm trying to get away from the idea that metaphysics is only something that professors do.
Good luck.
I'm wanting to suggest that metaphysics is the way we live. It's the way we're human. That it's a kind of interpretive act with the widest possible scope. And in the end, we can't avoid that widest possible scope about how we're connected to everything else and some image of what the whole is like. So it becomes incredibly existential.
Sure, don't get me wrong, I did metaphysics long before I was a professor.
This is what I think is happening in Augustine, and this is why I tried to link him to Bergson and to Whitehead, because I think they revive that sense of metaphysics as that kind of unavoidable existential act, as something as as much to do with existential feeling as with theoretical reflection, and I think to me that connects with the idea that from Augustine onwards, if you're doing Trinitarian theology properly, a total transformation of how you think of the structures of being within this world is indissociable from a transformation about how you're thinking about God. The two things go along together, and they're both, yes, radically apophatic. Because you more and more are showing that everything, as I said, is aporetic. For one thing, you can't make sense of it. You can only remotely feel it through a kind of gnosis, indeed, as David Bentley Hart would emphasize. Absolutely, it's becoming more and more negative. Because in a sense you're dissolving your assumptions about the structures of the world, and yet at the same time there is some positive residue, some sense that it's more about event and passage and conjecture and anticipation and feeling than you might have previously supposed. There's something just deeply radical in this legacy. It's about rethinking what we think metaphysics is about, but it does have some technical implications that, again, are not just technical. And I think, above all, it's putting pressure on the idea of the primacy of substance accident or on subject-predicate in grammar. This is what Bulgakov is onto. This is what Rosmini was already onto in the 19th century. That if the Father is, only intellect through the Word, through the Son, is there any longer this priority of substance over accident, subject over predicate? Perhaps we can't lose that primacy of the subject or the substance altogether, but it's shifting. If you're thinking in terms of event and relations, and it's shifting towards the idea that the substance or the subject is really never properly inside himself. You know, Augustine again and again suggests memory in me is bigger than me. I'm sort of turned inside out, and this kind of thing. So I think it's this shift away from the subject-predicate dominance, which is again why I'm surprisingly invoking Whitehead at this point, because he's precisely the thinker of this sort of thing.
Which is also why you should write more poetry.
Free weekends.
Father Thomas Joseph.
They're fewer and fewer. Okay.
I think the way I would address your question about to what extent do we need a precise or an ambitious metaphysics to do theology is to go back to your sort of first provocation about let's just call it the encroaching dangers of scientism, kind of crude materialism, but all too alluring materialism, which claims to give the simplest explanations of reality, which is anti-theistic and anti-Trinitarian at its core, and which is prevalent. And it's, I think, the greatest, not the only, but maybe the most prevalent generator of contemporary atheism and, as it were, intellectualized secularism. I'm not saying it's always sophisticated. I'm saying it's widespread. And it seems to me it poses a direct frontal challenge to a great deal of what's been happening, and I'm part of the problem in a certain sense, in modern theology, or in theology that's done in modernity with a strong historical inclination for that matter. And that's this, which is I don't think that there's been a strong engagement with the philosophy of science or a theology informed by a strong philosophy of nature that has been yet inducted in modern theology sufficiently. I don't mean that there are no people writing books about it, but I don't think it's become part of the common parlance of modern theology, and so we're at a hindrance to speak directly to this, as it were, spearhead of contemporary secularism, which is making a lot of converts. People are argued into materialist atheism very frequently through a kind of culture of scientism. Now, what seems to me significant in this respect is that there are some good developments in contemporary analytic philosophy in thinking that precisely to talk about the ontological foundations of scientific realism, we do need some kind of philosophical aspiration to ascribe natures and essences to things, to talk about powers, to talk about teleology, to talk about living beings as in some way irreducible to non-living ones, and persons as wholes that are not mere bundles of relations of matter. And so I think there are important conversations there to have metaphysically with the analytic philosophical trend that wants a non-reductive view of the sciences or wants to evoke metaphysics precisely to give some grounding to the realism of the sciences. And to think about how you can talk in I don't want to call it a banal way, but in a kind of common sense way about I think the earlier example was being brought fish to your dinner plate rather than meat. And you might extend that to talk about the kind of common natures we ascribe to things and properties, essences, powers, teleology, and that's a very difficult, complicated task. But if you can begin to do that and then can begin to have a non-reductive idea of life and of personhood, so you have non-living things, living things, and persons, then you can begin to evoke a common parlance by which you can also refer analogically to the mystery of God, the unknown creator, which our language has to in some way problematize our knowledge of, but also evokes the possibility of explanation. We can evoke the possibility of explanation of talking about if God exists, if God has a nature, and so forth. And that correlates our Trinitarian claims with a kind of approach from below. And I think these two things should be integrated and harmonious. But I do believe there, if you don't have something kind of precise you can bring to the table with the analytic philosophy guild and the contemporary scientists to talk about how there's a kind of metaphysical realism latent in the scientific aspiration, and that reductivity of the materialist kind is problematic, then you have trouble showing the vitality of Trinitarian theology. In that respect, I think you can speak to anyone, because I think everyone is somehow affected by the question of materialism.
So it seems like we have got our work cut out, and we ought to be thinking carefully and put 2 more good days into it. So are we going to take some questions in a moment? I first of all want to ask the panelists if there's anything that they particularly wanted to throw out for common discussion. No, in which case we'll have 15 minutes, 20 minutes or so of discussions from the floor.
Go ahead.
Ian Logan. I'm puzzled because I think we've forgotten something, and I think that's memory. We've actually not been talking about memory, and I don't know why. And I don't know whether memory still has a place in Trinitarian theology, but it's not coming through in the discussions today. Now, I'm interested in this. I'm interested in whether it's because actually we think it's passé, or whether actually we have forgotten it, and actually don't know how to articulate what memory is and what the role of memory is in the Trinity. But I'd be very interested in just to hear what your views are and see if my puzzlement can be removed or diminished.
Yeah, well, I probably haven't explained myself very well. I mean, memory is supposed to be absolutely central to what I'm talking about, because I'm wanting to view memory as an ontological category and not just a psychological one. I'm wanting to suggest that memory is a full part of reality, and it's not just in human beings. I'm somewhat indebted to my friend Rupert Sheldrake, who is here in the audience at the moment, on this issue. And again, in Rupert's thought, something of Bergson is in the background, and this idea that there is a kind of continuity between motion and memory, that all motion, that all existences in time have some sort of retention of what went before and are responding to what went before, and anticipating something to come. So that at the core of what I've been saying is the suggestion that when Augustine talks about memory, understanding, and will, if you read it against the background of everything he said about numbers and music, there is a semi-concealed ontological thesis about everything. He is really saying the structure of the whole of creation is something like memory, understanding, and will. It's not just a thesis about spiritual existence. It's most apparent in spiritual existence because spiritual existence most of all discloses the reality of creation. And for Augustine, as for all the fathers, it's spiritual creation that comes first. We're not sort of stuck down in a desert. The creation only happens through spirits. Augustine is as clear on this as the Greek fathers are. So that everything else, in a certain sense, only exists through spiritual existence. Nonetheless, everything, to some extent, is manifesting this structure, which includes memory, and which I think, I'm with Bergson here, can't really be explained in completely material terms. You know, there's nothing in the brain that really makes sense of how it is that we're phenomenologically somehow experiencing the past and the future as future. So yeah, memory is incredibly important for me.
Anyone else on memory? I think I'd want to pick up on Father Thomas Joseph's point about essences, the return of essences in science, this idea of intrinsic formal causes, things continuing to act to be the kind of things that they are. That's a kind of memory. And that's this whole argument about whether the category of essence is useful in science or not would be, in that sense, an argument about form and therefore about memory. Professor Boulnois? No?
Okay, you've provoked me to... So I think that's where... So Aquinas differs famously from Augustine on this point because he doesn't describe memory as he doesn't think it's a distinctive faculty. He thinks it's a kind of aspect of the intellect. But I do think what then takes the role of something like memory in his schema is something like essence, in that you have retention of substantial identity over time, and I would say not statically, but dynamically. In the dynamisms of the unfolding of the subject as substance, there's the reiterations of identity. But then when you think about the human being's intellect, the way that that's going to unfold, because that's an accident for Aquinas or property rather than substance, that's going to unfold as habitus. So there's interesting questions about how you could look at different dimensions of the human being as indicative of memory. I mean, there's the kind of continuity through time of the whole substantial form as a dynamic reality through time, but then there's also the way that our minds reverberate habitually with concealed and also acquired wisdom that then manifests itself, actualizing itself dynamically in particular moments. So I think you have analogies there to talk about the hidden mystery of the wellspring of divine paternity and what it means for God to give from himself to the Son and to give from himself in the Son to the world, and how that's analogous to life in time for us, and how it's analogous to human experience of time through habituated memory and the construal of order through time. So I think you pose a very important provocation.
Would you take another question?
Thanks very much to all of you and to all our speakers today for such a stimulating day. I'd like to follow on from what Professor Roseman said about the three books in Bonaventure, the book of creation, the book of the scriptures, and then the book of the incarnate word, whose brightest page, of course, as the medieval piety had it, is the crucifixion, where Christ writes in the ink of his own blood on the parchment of his skin. But I think, I don't want to doubt a Franciscan, but I presume Bonaventure made clear that the three books are not reprints, that there's something more in the scriptures that's not there in creation. There's something more in the incarnate word that's not simply there in the Old Testament. And when we go backwards then, let's say we've arrived at that final book with Christian faith, and we go back to the book of creation, presumably then we can reread creation in light of the cross. And if I'm a Christian physicist, I can think of electrons in light of the cross and rejoice because of what I read there in the book of creation. But I wouldn't necessarily criticize my non-Christian physicist friends for not doing the same thing. We don't speak of a Trinitarian physics. We don't think that there should be a Trinitarian physics, I presume. So to be very provocative, why should we think there's a Trinitarian ontology?
Oh, I'd want to fit Trinitarian physics. Oh, yeah. I really would. Well, I mean, actually, there's a serious aspect to that, because I was talking about the questionability of the physics-metaphysics division. You know, I mean, Aristotle sees motion as real, but why doesn't it have a categorical status, you know? And in Neoplatonism, in fact, there isn't a physics-metaphysics division. Neither of the word means anything, you know. Origener's great work is called The Division of Nature. In other words, it's a physics. And because natura is physis. So you know, there are rising degrees of analogical motion after Plotinus, who has a stronger view of kinesis than Aristotle does. So maybe our whole idea of a massive division between physics and metaphysics isn't completely correct. You know, why does modern physics deliver us with these, you know, metaphysical conundra? Now, I mean, I suppose, you know, one core of how we understand science as experimental science, as repeatability and predictability and so on, you could say is constrained. But when it becomes sort of theoretical and speculative, which it has to do if it's going to set up new experiments and so on, it's really within the realm of natural philosophy. And, you know, the term science was only invented in this university in about 1830. You know, the Germans had always talked about natural philosophy. And maybe, you know, some of our confusions to do with the fact that really scientists are also doing natural philosophy, and that's not really clearly distinguished from metaphysics and so on. And so maybe a complete account of motion, especially if it's a vitalist one, and if, you know, what goes on in our mind is linked to the fundamental processes of nature, yeah, then sure, you would have a Trinitarian physics.
If I may add something, from the point of view of a historian of the metaphysics, it is clear that at the beginning, for example, Augustine himself called what he was doing, he called it dialectica. So it was a sort of logic of the Trinity. Later on, one century later, Boethius coined in Latin the word theologia, which did not exist in Latin before, had another sense in Latin before, and he does it in a treatise that we call now his De Trinitate. So theologia was, for the whole time from the Middle Ages until I don't know when, it was the name, theology, because it deals with the nature of God, of course. So it's the logic of the divinity. And actually, Boethius says theologica, theologica scientia, theological science. He doesn't say theology. And later on appeared metaphysics, but I have no clue that it was used for the Trinity. I didn't find the expression metaphysics of the Trinity in the Middle Ages. It's much later, I think. So you see, it has taken a long time. And ontology is a term which was coined in the beginning of the 17th century. So the words took a long time to be created, and ontology was not dealing with Trinity either, of course.
I mean, I think the analogy of the three books and reading one book in light of the other is an interesting one, and we can certainly all think of books that, when read in light of further books, will never again have the same meaning. I mean, Henry IV, Part 1, read in the light of Henry IV, Part 2, or Othello, read in the light of The Winter's Tale, or things like that, the Old Testament read in the light of the New Testament. And I'm sure, on the other hand, that some of those books can be read in their own lights, and have intrinsic meaning. Now, I would not want to affirm that possibility of intrinsic meaning for human history, of course. I mean, I'm not a pure nature advocate. I do think that if we know of human nature without revelation, all we can see is a puzzle or a conundrum that needs to be solved. I'm very open. I have not come to a conclusion on the question whether nature itself can be seen other than in the light of revelation. It might be that there's an obediential potency there that does not in itself have to be resolved through revelation, although with hindsight we can see that it is. That's for other minds.
I think we would have time for one more question. If we take one from somewhere up here, for the sake of some sort of arbitrary parity.
Hello. Yes. I was intrigued by the concept of good enough metaphysics. And throughout the day, there's been a few references to the effects of the fall, noetic effects of the fall. And I wonder, from a perspective of Trinitarian ontology, what can we say about the place of grace in doing metaphysics vis-a-vis the threat of intellectual works?
I suppose I want to make the comment that for a surprising number of people at the moment, it seems like the study of metaphysics is a kind of surprising means of grace. You know, that after decades where this was supposed to be off the table in terms of how you came to God, suddenly for certain people, and more than might be expected, it does seem to be something that particularly quickens the heart and draws people back to God. But that's a maybe flippant point, but I think it's worth noting.
Well, I suppose I have a very particular view, although it's a very traditional Thomistic view. And I think that human beings, I don't think any human being or any human culture is metaphysically innocent. It seems to me that human beings do formulate concepts that touch effectively upon what the medievals called the transcendental dimensions of reality, and they construe reality in ways that can be more or less realistic or unrealistic. They make mistakes, they make advances. They're helped by dialectic because it makes them, cultures are helped by dialectic and individuals are helped by dialectic because it makes us compare and contrast our views with those who contest ours or who hold other opposed views, and it helps us sort things out. And I think it's just part of being a human animal is that we make metaphysical progress through time. And so I don't really believe in what I would call to put it in strong language, the myth of a theologically, a non-metaphysical theology. I've had this argument a lot with the Barthians and the whole question of epistemological works righteousness. You can see Barth arguing this very clearly in his debates with Brunner in the book No, where he says that any attempt to try to construe the reality ontologically is already an attempt to do so before and without God and prior to grace. I don't think that that's true at all. I think that often people try to construe, that might be too narrow a view of grace. I think God often helps people try to make sense of reality outside the ambit of explicit reflection on revelation. And grace can be at work in human beings trying to make sense of their lives morally and metaphysically, so to speak, in ways that are congruent with, if not identical with, explicit belief in revelation or the construal of the world in a Christian fashion. And it seems to me in the history of the church always engages with cultures in their moral and ontological commitments and challenges them, purifies them, receives a lot of them, and ennobles them with the grace of Christ. So I just think there always is this irreducible dimension. I think the term pure nature you have to be very careful about because it's used in very different ways by different people. Some people mean a mode of being, that's what I mean, a mode of being of nature without grace, having been created without being a state of grace, which Aquinas rejects. I don't hold that view. But some people mean by pure nature simply that there is such a thing as intelligible essence to human nature. Whether we can perceive it prior to grace or afterwards, or aspects of it prior to, is an interesting question. But that there is, as it were, a philosophically intelligible dimension to human nature is something I believe. I think theology is harmed by moving away from that position. It seems to me that in talking to our colleagues and talking to ordinary people who are trying to investigate the Christian mystery, I think we have to have a way to talk to them about a kind of common, you might call it ecumenical, I mean it in a very loose metaphorical sense, an ecumenical knowledge of reality. And I think the church has created what is termed somewhat crudely a perennial philosophy in order to have a linguistic toolbox to articulate our fundamental understanding of reality we share ecumenically with all human beings. And often the church tries to alert people to their natural knowledge. She never does that without reference to Christ, or she shouldn't. It's done organically with the commitment to Christian knowledge. So I'll just finish by saying I'm here on this point. I think Maritain is right to say, distinguish to unite. We have to distinguish philosophy of nature from, or metaphysics, philosophy of nature and metaphysics of a kind, or ontology if you like, from the formal objects of revelation, but distinguishing them without ever separating, because we do use our knowledge of natures to think constructively about Christ, about the Trinity, about human beings in grace. And yes, I agree, there's an ontology of grace for sure. How else would we think about it otherwise? And so we create an organic unity precisely by making some necessary distinctions. When we don't make those necessary distinctions, I think we fall under we endanger our capacity to speak to our colleagues in ways that invite them into a larger organic Christian vision of reality.
Thank you. I think I'm going to call time on the discussions, and first of all, thank my four colleagues here for their marvellous contributions over the last hour. We'll give them a round of applause. Then the other thing to say is we've heard a lot, as we need to on a conference on Trinitarian Ontology, of gratuity and grace, and it has felt to me today like we have been granted something and more than we expected in that way, which God is wont. So thank you to everyone who's contributed today. And the second thing is to say we're wrapping it up. I hope that for those who want it, the evening will be characterized by that sort of communality and joy, which is in its own way an image of the Trinitarian life. And we start promptly tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Thank you.